Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Leading with Optimism in Challenging Times. I'm Cindy Thomas. I'm the Director of Leadership Training at NAC, and will be your host throughout the day. We'll be together for the next hour or so. We just want to go over some quick housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be available in the Health Center Resource Clearinghouse. Afterwards, you will get a notification when that is available. If you object to the recording, you can disconnect at any time. We will be using the chat feature over on the right-hand side of your screen. We will not have the Q&A open like our slide does say, but use the chat. You can communicate with our panelists, our participants, post questions and engagement throughout the time. We appreciate seeing you and engaging with you during the webinar. You should be seeing a dual screen right now. You should see the slides and then the speaker screen. If you put your cursor between the two, you should be able to slide and move that and adjust the size of the slides or the presenter so that you can meet your preference, whichever you like, to see the best. Let me get us started by introducing our esteemed panel today. We'll start with Sean Achor. Sean is considered one of the world's leading experts on the connection between happiness and success. Sean is the New York Times bestselling author of The Happiness Advantage, Big Potential, and The Orange Frog. His research on mindset made the cover of Harvard Business Review. His TED Talk is one of the most popular of all times with more than 24 million views, and he has lectured or worked with more than a third of Fortune 100 companies, as well as the NFL, NBA, Pentagon, and the White House. Sean spent over a decade living, researching, and lecturing at Harvard University, and draws on his own research, including one of the largest studies of happiness and potential at Harvard, and more recently on the effects of positivity in organizations facing severe trauma, to show how our potential can be unleashed and our people re-energized when we focus on pursuing happiness now, especially during these times of challenge and uncertainty. We also have Jordan Voigt, the president of Genesis Medical Center in Davenport, Iowa. Genesis Medical Center Davenport is the largest hospital medical center of the Genesis Health System. He has firsthand knowledge of the importance of health centers in our communities through the strong partnership with Community Healthcare Inc., and a health center in the Quad Cities that provides service to more than 40,000 individuals. In 2020, due in part to his contributions, Genesis was recognized among the top 5 small health systems in the US by Fortune, IBM Watson Health. And from its system-wide implementation of the Orange Frog Workshop in challenging times, Genesis Medical Center was recently announced as ATD's Excellence in Practice Award winner for 2021 in the category of Change Management. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Sean so that he can get us started and talk to us about leading with optimism. Sean?
Cindy, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I am so honored and thrilled to have this opportunity to get to come share this research with you. Part of the reason that I'm so grateful to have this opportunity today to get to talk to you is that when I first got into doing this research, actually, when I first went off to college to start collecting educational debts, my father was buoyed by the idea that maybe someday I would come back and I would be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, something he thought would make a lot of sense. When I came home from college and told him, Dad, I want to study the science of happiness, he sat me down. My father was a neuroscientist at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and he told me that the average scientific paper, the average scientific journal article is only read on average by 7 people total, which is incredibly depressing for a researcher to hear, especially because I know that that statistic also includes my mom. So now we're down to 6 people who read these studies, which is a travesty because what we've been learning about, I believe, literally transforms what it means to be human. I'm grateful to be able to speak to you here today because I think that this research matters more now than it ever has. And given the incredible, meaningful, but also exhausting and draining work that you've had to do for more than a year, what I'd love to do is to be able to lift up the work that you're doing, to validate it with this research, but also to pour back into some of the tools in which we've learned that can create these ripple effects that not only improve our own levels of happiness and meaning, But based upon this research and the science and evidence-based approach, we found ways of creating a ripple effect that occur 2, 3, 4 degrees separate from the people who initially hear the information and try it out themselves. So I'm so grateful we have hundreds of people joining us here today. I know that you impact so many people in your lives. And what I know is that sharing the research we get to today and getting to have my good friend Jordan Voigt get to talk to you about the ways in which he's seen this research come alive in a medical center in Iowa. What we're going to get to do is be able to find a way of impacting people that never get to see this talk or get to hear this research in person. So I'm so grateful. There's so much I want to talk about, and I really want to get to Jordan so we can really talk about how we can actually implement these ideas and the incredible research we got to do with them over the past 4 years. So I'm just going to jump right into it if it's okay. So where I would love to start is where I started my TED Talk. And then we're going to deviate completely from there to talk about all of this new research we got to do in 2020. I know many of you might have seen the TED Talk or had your teams be able to watch it, but I need the story for something we're going to talk about in just a moment. So I started all of this academic research when I was just 7 years old. So if any of you have children and they're 7, and they're not doing academic research, you're clearly not pushing them hard enough. But when I was 7 and my sister was 5 years old, I was 2 years older than my sister at the time, and we were playing up on top, and I'm 2 years older than her now. But at the time, that meant she had to do everything I wanted to do, and I wanted to play war. So we're up on top of these bunk beds. I don't know how many of you had bunk beds growing up. I loved them. I would still have them now if they were socially acceptable at all for a married guy. But on one side of the bunk bed, I had all of my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry lined up. And on my sister's side, she had all of her My Little Ponies and unicorns lined up for this cavalry charge. I wasn't too concerned about what was going to happen. I'd won this war every single time we had played in the past. And if I was losing, the rules of engagement would change. There are differing accounts of what happened that afternoon, but since my sister was not invited to come speak with you here today, you get to hear the true story, which is my sister is a little bit on the clumsy side. And somehow, without any help or push from her loving older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with this crash on the floor. And I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister, and I saw that she had landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that my sister and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I had accidentally broken Amy's arm just 1 week before this, and don't take her side, you don't know her. But I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior. And I saw my sister's face this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had just settled. So I did the only thing that my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. And if you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, please, 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 please don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that. She stopped mid-cry with confusion on her face and looked up at me, and I had no idea where else that was going. That was the extent of the strategy. So I blurted out the only other thing I could think of, which is, Amy, I think this means you're a unicorn, which was cheating. There's literally nothing in the world Amy would have wanted more in that moment, to not be Amy, the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy, the special unicorn. Of course, an option open to her brain at no point in the past. And you could see on my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict as her brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering and surprise she had experienced falling off of a bunk bed, or contemplating this newfound identity as a unicorn on the other side, and the latter won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking our parents with all the negative consequences that were about to ensue for both of us, instead a smile spread across her face, and she bounded right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn. What we had stumbled across at the tender age of 5 and 7, we had no idea at the time was something that was going to be at the vanguard of a scientific revolution we're lucky enough to be living through right now, especially given all the things that we are experiencing in the world. We're living through twin revolutions. We're living through a technological revolution everyone knows about, but hidden behind the technological revolution is a corresponding human revolution few people are talking about. For example, we've been philosophizing about what it is to be human in the midst of challenging times for thousands of years. And yet for the first time in human history, we now have tools like neuroimaging, which means we get to peer behind the curtain to see what the human brain is doing as you're architecting a picture of your reality. And here's what we found. Your brains are amazing. I know many of you are like, I knew that, but your brain is phenomenal. Your brain is processing about 40 bits of information consciously every second. The only problem is your brain is receiving around 11 to 14 million pieces of information every second, which means as we looked at the world in 2020, why we tried to do our jobs, why we tried to care for people who are sick, caring for our elderly parents and our kids at home in virtual school in the midst of the stress and anxiety and uncertainty we were feeling, both in terms of health and in politics, it turns out in the midst of all of that, your brain was not processing this world. Our brains were only processing a few snowflakes in the midst of a blizzard, which means that if our brains are scanning first for the negatives, the hassles, the complaints, the frustrations, the threats, the symptoms that are omnipresent in every environment and every time in human history, in those moments when we did the neuroimaging, we found your brain has no resources even left over to scan the world for the meaningful impacts you're having upon it, nor the things you're grateful for in your present life, nor the ways we could transform this reality into a better reality for all of us. What we found, it sounds as if based upon that research, that scientifically, all you have to do is pull some of the resources from the negative to process some of the positive. But here's the problem. If you have children and they're in high school, we're teaching them exactly what we taught you, which is you are your genes plus your environment. Genes plus environment predict whether or not you joined us here today. Genes plus environment predict our potential and our success rate and our ability to create resilience in times that are difficult. The problem is that we're victims actually of both. No one watching this got to pick their parents. And as we saw in 2020, the world, the environment has become so big, not only can we not control the macro environment, we are really struggling to control the micro environment as well. So what happened to so many of us in the midst of 2020 is that it felt as if happiness was dramatically out of our control. There's nothing we can do because happiness is dependent on two things upon which we are victims of. So we were buffeted by our genes or the environment. And if you ask somebody why they're not happy in a current moment, they will usually reference something that's going on in their environment or their genes or their family history. But if you allow me to, I would love to geek out for 1 minute to tell you about positive psychology and why it's going to change the lens through which we view the research that we got to do in 2020 and the work we've been doing in 50 countries and some of the most difficult environments in the entire world over the past decade. What we do in positive psychology is in science, we normally care about the average. And if in psychology, we normally care about if you fall below average, which means you have depression or disorder. In positive psychology, they said, if we're doing that, we're eliminating the entire positive side of the curve. So in every economics class and every statistics class that many of you have had, one of the very first things that we teach people is how do we delete the weirdos from the data? How do we delete the outliers that are messing up my average? Because normally what we care about is the average. So we find out who the outliers are, we delete them, and we have a cleaner average that's coming through. But if we study what's merely average, we will remain merely average in our companies and our schools worldwide. What positive psychology posits is that instead of deleting those weirdos, which I know we're joined by many of them here today, and you're going to get to hear from a weirdo in just a minute, Jordan Voigt. But what we found is that what if those weirdos aren't statistical anomalies? What if we study them and it turns out in the midst of challenging times, those weirdos were changing their daily habits. They were changing their work routines to make them positive. They were deepening their social bonds. They were changing how they process the news and who they hung out with. If they did one of those 5 things in the midst of 2020, those individuals, those weirdos, they break the tyranny of genes and environment over their trajectory of optimism and happiness. And when that occurs, it led to the research I was doing back at Harvard for 12 years. As the brain becomes more positive than your genetic threshold, it turns out every single business and educational outcome we know how to test for rises dramatically, and some, but not all of our health outcomes as well. What we were starting to realize was that the greatest advantage in the modern economy was having a positive, engaged brain, which meant 2 full things. One, before we've even gone very far yet today, what we were starting to see emerge from this data is that your levels of happiness could change even in difficult environments. That these outliers were showing that we don't have to just be our genes or environment. By making conscious habits in the midst of a difficult environment, it had a protective factor, inoculating our emotional immune system against the negative effects of our genes or our environment. But not only that, what we found is that the greatest advantage you could give to a brain in the modern economy, given all the challenges we're experiencing, is not something that the lucky inherit by having the best genes or living in the richest parts of our communities. It's something we could cultivate, train, educate, and suddenly, and parent, and suddenly I got hooked. I've been doing this ever since. And given the incredible work you do for communities that so desperately need not only our help in terms of our physical health, but our mental and emotional health as well, what we're finding is that this research started with what we could do to transform our pursuit of happiness. What I'd love to share with you are some of those findings that I think walking away from here today, you'll you're going to want to tell this to your kids around the dinner table tonight. This is something you're going to want to email out to people that you work with. This is something you're going to want to change the way that you lead tomorrow. I believe this because we've seen it over and over again. You're going to get to hear Jordan today about how he took this initial information, brought it to life, and completely transformed Genesis Medical System in Iowa. And in doing so, even in the midst of one of the most difficult periods their hospital had experienced, while some of the department's levels of fatigue and burnout were rising, like we saw across the entire health industry, the teams we touched with this positive psychology intervention wrapped around this narrative called the Orange Frog, turns out their burnout on those teams within a 6-week period of time dropped nearly in half. Same environment, same institution, same care for the patients, and yet a dramatic change in the trajectory of their levels of happiness. And in doing so, it dramatically improved the patient safety and satisfaction afterwards. So the ripple effect became amazing. Now, before we go and get into any of that information, I don't want to steal any of Jordan's thunder. I think two things are important to say before we get into what this research actually shows. One of them is, in studying happiness, I think it's crucial that we get past our happiness hesitancy. That happiness hesitancy is based upon happiness anxiety, which is this idea that either we don't want to start feeling happy because we see what happens when we see what happens in this world, where suddenly everything can come crashing down. 2 years ago, we had no idea that a global pandemic was definitely going to be coming in 2020, right? So what happens for many people is they start to feel happiness anxiety. When they feel happiness, they put the brakes on their own levels of happiness because they don't want to crash down. The other side of it, which we saw so much in 2020, is it tone deaf to talk about happiness when we know that others are suffering not only from a pandemic, but from systemic racism and inequalities in the system? While it sounds noble to say, I won't feel happy when somebody else is suffering, what we're finding is the resulting impact is the exact opposite of the noble response that we wanted. Because what we're finding is that when your brain is more positive, your ability to impact other people rises dramatically. Your energy levels, your productivity, your ability to create positive change rises dramatically in almost every single domain within our lives when our brain is positive. So if I know someone is suffering on my street, knowing that he's suffering, if I put the brakes on looking for optimism or joys I'm feeling with my family, or moments of meaning in my life, or successes we have as we care for people within our community, it turns out not only do we not have the energy to help that person, we now have two people who are now in a deficit state. What we're looking for is, how do we find a way of actually doing the exact opposite? If we have the ability to, given the life that we have, is there some way that we could lean into happiness, lean into optimism when we feel fatigued? Finding some way of being able to fill up that cup, and in doing so, being able to have that cup pour out back over to those people who are suffering within our lives. So we're looking not for complacency. We're looking for a belief system. Happiness is not based upon this idea that the world doesn't need to change. Happiness is the belief that the world can change, and it gives us the very fuel to do that. So the happiness we're talking about here is not pleasure, it's the joy we feel moving towards our potential. The other side of it is, I gave this information to a group of CEOs out in Northern California, all CEOs of top software companies. And afterwards, one of the CEOs offered to have me, offered to drive me to the airport after my talk, which I was so excited about. I got into this guy's really nice sports car. This is pre-pandemic, obviously, and got into this guy's really nice sports car. I don't know what was fancy. It was a fancy car. It was, the doors went up instead of out. I figured out how to close it, and it wasn't a Tesla. Got in, figured out how to close the door, put on my seatbelt. He immediately started telling me his company had been growing so quickly over the past 3 years. His stress levels have been skyrocketing. And as he was speeding towards the airport and weaving all over the road, and I was holding on for dear life, wondering why I got in the car with this guy, that little bell was going off in the car, the seatbelt bell. And eventually it stopped going off. It got tired. I turned to him, I said, I'm sorry, you don't wear seatbelts? He said, no, Sean, I listened to your talk. I love your research. I'm an optimist too. And kept driving and talking. And I listened to this guy. I was like, no, you're not an optimist. You're crazy. What we're finding is that that type of response to the world is irrational optimism. And when we sugarcoat the present, we make terrible decisions for the future. You can see it in the response we had to the pandemic. If we sugarcoat the present, we make terrible decisions because we don't actually solve the problems we need to. The other side of it is we see a problem, we get so focused on it that we start to become paralyzed by it and don't think that any change is possible. Both lead to not solving that problem. What I'm interested in is how do we take that middle approach? How do we start with realism? Realism about what people are experiencing, realism about our own fatigue, realism about the strengths and weaknesses of the current system. But in the midst of the realism, maintaining the belief that my behavior will eventually matter if linked to the people around me. That approach led to the research that we were doing around big potential. Big potential is a change in the research that I've been doing over the past few years, where what I got fascinated by was what if we stop studying happiness in isolation and look at the ripple effect people like you are having upon entire communities. So I had that book come out 3 years ago, and I know it came out 3 years ago. It was all about how happiness and success, our approach to it has to be interconnected. It was all this research we've been doing on big data at these big medical centers and schools worldwide. So I know it came out 3 years ago because my wife was pregnant with our daughter at the time, and she was going to be born in April. So we thought, let's have the book come out the first week of February. Then I can completely get off the road, and I'll be there for my wife and our child when she's born. 2 days before the book came out, which you spend 4 years writing and you're doing all this work, so 2 days before the book came out, during the Super Bowl, during the first quarter, while the Patriots were playing, my wife's water broke 2.5 months early. Now, we didn't know that was what was going on. And it was during the Super Bowl. So she Ubered to the hospital, husband of the year. I got her an XL, so that was fancy. But she got there and they said, ma'am, your water broke. You need to stay here for the next 6 weeks holding this baby in. And then 3 days later, our daughter was born. We almost lost her 3 times over the next 2-day period of time. Her name is Zoe Sparks Acor because she kept sparking back to life, and she's downstairs. You'll hear her screaming, running around. She's doing wonderfully. But instead of going on a book tour to talk about this research on why we needed an interconnected approach to happiness and success, instead, my happiness sat in an incubator in NICU for the next 50 days, being cared for by these angels that were keeping her alive when my success rate of keeping Zoe alive would have been 0. What we got to do is to battle test the research that leads us into this happiness work that we've been doing. That book starts with 2 studies that I want to share with you here today. One of them is that these 2 researchers in Virginia, this is one of those studies you're going to want to tell somebody else about. If you have kids, this is absolutely one of the conversations you're going to want to have with them. What we found is that these 2 researchers out in Virginia found if you look at a hill you need to climb in front of you, if you look at that hill by yourself, your brain shows you a picture of a hill that is 20 to 30% steeper when you're alone compared to when you're standing next to someone who's going to climb that hill with you. That's incredible. The hill is not changing. I always thought if I saw an obstacle, I know whether or not we can overcome it. Let's be realistic. That's not how the human brain works at all. It turns out that when you're in a state of being alone, overcoming an obstacle, your brain shows you a hill that's 20 to 30% steeper than the hill you see standing next to someone who's going to climb it with you. Then we found out it wasn't just the physical ones, it's the emotional ones as well. Overcoming depression and anxiety, overcoming burnout, caring for aging parents and children in virtual school in the midst of a global pandemic with political uncertainty, in the midst of those challenges, as we doom scrolled through Twitter, as we looked at what was going on in the news, it turns out in the midst of those hills that we saw in front of us were constantly in flux based upon whether or not you think you're alone or with others overcoming this challenge, which not only has a huge implication for how we care for patients, but it also has this huge implication for how people deal with challenges at work. It means happiness can't be self-help, right? As soon as you say, go work on your happiness, we make happiness 20 to 30% steeper for people to achieve. Instead, we need to create a cultural response, which is why we've had so much success with the work that we were doing with Jordan at Genesis Health Systems about not just creating happiness individually, but creating a culture that was based upon rational optimism and deeper social connection. The second study from Big Potential is about fireflies. There are fireflies and lightning bugs across the globe, but they all light up individually and randomly in the dark to attract a mate. And when they do so, scientists found that the cap on their success rate is 3% in terms of reproduction per night per bug, which is still really good. But it turns out in 2 places of the globe, they discovered species that figured out how to do something different. Instead of lighting up individually and randomly in the dark, like fireflies do across the globe, instead these species created develop these neurotransmitters so they can light up and go dark as an interconnected community. And when they do so, it turns out when they light up together and go dark together, it turns out that their success rate doesn't stop at 3%. It suddenly goes to 82% per bug. It wasn't like one bug was doing really, really well with the system, right? Like, keep going, guys. This is the best night of my life. The entire system was doing orders of magnitude better than we thought was possible because we thought we knew how the world worked. We thought it was survival of the fittest, and it's not. It's survival of the best fit with the ecosystem around us. So the question becomes, how do we actually find a way of lighting up other people in the darkness so that our response to the world is actually orders of magnitude higher than it would have been had we tried to create success and happiness alone? Which led to the work we were doing with the happiness advantage. Simply put, what we found is most people follow a formula for happiness and success that goes like this. We think, if I work harder, I'll be more successful. And as soon as we achieve these goals, think how happy we'll be. Work harder, be more successful, then I'll feel happier. Think how often we do that, right? As soon as I get to the weekend, think how happy I'll be. As soon as we get to the summer, think how happy I'll be. As soon as the pandemic is over, think how happy I'll be. As soon as I get my vaccine, think how happy I'll be all the time. As soon as I get married, think how happy I'll be all the time, right? Remember that one? I'll be happy forever, right? But then you have kids, you also kind of want them to be happy, right? Or as soon as I get that promotion, or as soon as I get that degree, as soon as I graduate from high school, think how happy I'll be. That formula, which is how most people follow happiness and success. You can hear it. You'll know you're doing it if over the next 3 to 4 days, you catch yourself thinking, I will feel happy when. That formula is based upon a misunderstanding about how the human brain works. Back in the 50s, we found that every time your brain has a success, your brain changes the goalpost of what success looks like. That sounds so innocuous, right? Otherwise, the very first time you put Legos together as a 4-year-old, you would have been done. If I ask you if you're successful today, you're like, yes, Sean, I put those Legos together when I was 4. We literally talk about this every time we meet up. What's the problem? But if you learn addition, we want to know, can you learn calculus? And then can you learn how to improve other people's lives? And can you create a business? And can you run a family? We want those bars to keep rising. If you can care for 100 people, what if you could care for 150? The problem is that those two ideas are completely incompatible with one another. Because what we just said is, for the brain, success is a moving target, which is great. We want to see what the body's capable of and your brain is capable of. The problem is if we follow a formula that I'll work harder, then I'll be successful, then I'll feel happier, we put happiness on the opposite side of success, which your brain never gets to. We push it over what we call the cognitive horizon. Your brain never gets to happy. We thought, I get good grades in high school, think how happy I'll be. Don't get excited yet. You need to get into a better school. You get into a good school. As soon as I get my degree and finish these exams, think how happy I'll be. But then you don't even have a job. You get a job, you get your targets, we raise your targets. You help this number of people. We want to see if you can help more people. We raise up your leadership, we raise up your income. Then you're wondering, how can I make this even bigger? And then challenges come, and then you have a family. Once we retire, think how happy we'll be. Even the idea of, as soon as the pandemic is over, think how happy I'll be. You can see very quickly, a lot of people thought when they got the vaccine back in January, think how happy I'll finally feel. And yet, for many of them, their behavior didn't change radically, right? Because they still had to be so careful. So it didn't automatically create happiness. When the pandemic is over, it turns out we don't go all to a state of 100% happy. We know that because we weren't at 100% happy before the pandemic began. And yet, oftentimes people feel like, as soon as it's over, then I'll feel happy, as if we were all happy and then suddenly the pandemic messed everything up. In fact, the CDC found the depression rates had doubled in the decade leading up to the pandemic. So the question then becomes, how do we create happiness? If that formula doesn't work, what do we do to pursue happiness within our lives, especially given this world we're in right now? So back in the 80s, they found that if you prime 4-year-old kids while doing spatial memory tests to think of their happiest memory, and they're 4-year-olds, they usually say something like, I had Jello for lunch. You can see those parents pounding through the glass that you can't see through, being like, it was Disney, I spent $600. Whatever it is that caused the child to be happy instead of the parent, turns out their spatial memory scores improved by 60% in the positive category. Why? Happiness and spatial memory, those are separate parts of the brain. Then they found out that if you prime doctors, this study was on 3rd-year medical students, to read through patient histories, they found in a positive, negative, neutral state, turns out in the positive state, the 3rd-year medical students were 19% faster and more accurate at coming up with the correct diagnosis, and showed 3 times the intellectual flexibility around a misdiagnosis, which should have been healthcare industry transforming, yet only 7 people read these studies. Then they found out It's all of them. Every business outcome we know how to test for at Harvard Business School rises dramatically when the human brain is positive first. Your brain is 31% more productive. Your creativity triples, problem solving triples. Turns out intelligence rises, memory improves. Everything we test for on the SAT and ACT standardized tests in the United States for students rises dramatically when the human brain is more positive. We learn languages faster, we live longer, our symptoms become less acute, our social bonds deepen. It turns out the greatest advantage you can give to a brain in the modern economy is to make it more positive and engaged, which meant the formula was actually backwards. This is a mindset shift, but I actually believe it's the most practical of the suggestions we find within positive psychology, because from this flows all the practical changes that occur within our lives and the ways in which you're about to hear Jordan talk about what he did at Genesis in Iowa. So what that meant was, instead of thinking, if I work harder and we achieve these goals, think how happy we'll be. Instead, the real formula is if we can deepen our levels of gratitude, optimism, or social connection, or perceive more meaning in our work, every single success rate for us will rise dramatically, creating a ripple effect to the communities around us. The formula is backwards. So the question is, how do we marry those ideas together? How do we marry the idea that we need to prioritize being positive now and the idea that we need to be pursuing happiness and success with one another, lighting each other up in the darkness instead of doing it alone? I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the behavioral changes we could do at the individual level that led into the work Jordan's doing, because I want to give you just some of those things that you could do post this session, but then to hear Jordan talk about how we make this come alive with one another. How do we do this in a big potential way? So at the individual level, I met up with the former U.S. Surgeon General, at the time former, Vivek Murthy, and I said, it's so challenging because people don't think they can change their happiness. Because they think, you just have genes for pessimism or optimism. You're born a pessimist, you die a pessimist, end of the story. He said, it's amazing. Everyone in this room has genes for teeth that should rot out by age 15 in a high sugar society. That's what it is to be human, unless you create a habit of brushing your teeth for 30 seconds a day. Then what it is to be human changes dramatically from your genes. We would never say, well, of course my kid has, cavities. He's born with teeth that will rot out by age 15. No, we teach all of our kids to brush their teeth, and it becomes such an integral part of our lives. I believe the same thing is true with happiness. The problem is we default to our genes. I think we all have genes that will predispose us to threat detection, and especially given the world we live in right now, this hyper activated by the news that we receive. But given those genes, if you create a habit that takes less than 2 minutes a day, walking away from the session, it turns out that your response to the world, what it is to be human, changes dramatically. I'm going to give you just 3 of those that have had the highest levels of success. We can talk about big potential in terms of Jordan's work. So in short, one of the things we looked at was gratitude. With bankers in the middle of the banking crisis, where they thought the global economy was going to collapse. So parallel stresses to the one we've been experiencing over the past year. We got them every day when they came into work to do something positive. If you believe happiness leads to success, the next question you should be asking is, what are we doing to raise levels of happiness for the team before we try to create positive impacts upon people's lives, right? Before we do our work. If we want our kids to do well at school, how do we find ways of priming them to be positive before they start studying, instead of once you've studied, then we can celebrate? What we're finding is that reversal has huge implications. So at American Express, I got them to write down 3 things that they were grateful for to start work in the middle of a banking crisis. And 21 days later, no impact upon them. Why? Gratitude's so good for you. It turns out I misunderstood gratitude. And this is why we do the research, because this is crucial. I could tell you gratitude is good for you, but that's actually inaccurate in the way that I just described it. What we found based upon the research, 2 researchers, actually, Emmons and McCullough, told me why I was wrong. They said, it doesn't matter what you're grateful for. What matters is the scanning. There's a part of the brain that scans for positives, that if every day when you come into work, you're grateful for your work, your family, and your health, that part of your brain that scans for gratitude never gets activated. And that's the important part. So for 21 days in a row, we simply got people to scan for 3 new things that they were grateful for that occurred over the past 24 hours. That's it. 3 new things they could never repeat. And for 21 days, they wrote down 63 unique things that they were grateful for when work was the hardest it had ever been. They weren't getting paid, and they thought the entire global economy was going to collapse. 21 days later, people who were testing as pessimists, who always test as pessimists, who we assume were genetic pessimists, 21 days later, they were testing as low-level optimists on average. 6 months later, they're testing as low to moderate level of optimists if they kept the pattern going, just like we keep brushing our teeth. Turns out, for those who care, what we found is your brain builds a background app, passively scanning the world for the positives. So without doing anything, your brain is trying to be efficient. It scans for positives throughout the day, which suddenly these pinpricks of positivity, even in the midst of a pandemic, transforms the way our brains process the world. We suddenly see more meaning. We see things we're more grateful for. We find greater levels of happiness, and we're like, what, did the world just change, or am I sleeping more? And what we're finding is it was a 45-second disruptor, just like brushing your teeth, scanning for 3 new things you're grateful for. We did this with Orlando Health, a Trauma One hospital in Orlando. And at every one of their staff meetings, instead of doing it individually, we got them to do, each person in the room would say one thing that they were grateful for before starting their staff meeting. We burned all of our social capital, as you can manage, getting this off the ground. Grizzled veterans doing life or death decisions about resource allocation, about what goes on in the world. And here's what we found. When they did this, they started doing it. And at first they said, we've got so much work we have to do, literally life or death decisions like you have to make. When you come in the meeting, already have one thing that you're grateful for, so that you can say as fast as possible, we can get to everyone in the staff meeting within less than a minute. And they started doing it virtually as well in the current environment. So they did it for 2 weeks and they did it for 2 months. Then if they started a meeting at 2 months without starting with the positives, they felt like something was wrong, right? People would call them on it. The culture started to shift. 2 years later, almost to the day we started it, the Pulse nightclub shooting occurred 3 streets away from them. The second largest mass shooting in US history. And all the victims from the Pulse nightclub shooting came to a hospital system that had been using 1 minute of gratitude at staff meetings to deepen social bonds in case the unthinkable ever happened. The very next morning, they started their meetings with gratitudes because that was their culture, and they said it was universal. They were so grateful they hadn't wasted 2 years just working with the people that they worked with. That those bonds were deepening, because if I hear someone is grateful their kids made them pancakes last night or this morning, I think, I love pancakes. I like my kids. Suddenly, a social bond starts to get emerge. We find that joy deepens our bonds even more strongly than just going through difficult challenges together. But when you have both, we transform the meaningful narratives we talk about the rest of our lives. So what we were finding was gratitude in short form was creating huge impacts. We found 15 minutes of fun, mindful cardio activity. A brisk walk, this is research done by the antidepressant companies, was the equivalent of taking a strong antidepressant for the next 6 months. But for the next 2 years, you had a 30% lower relapse rate. That's obviously not a repudiation of antidepressants. It's an indication of why exercise was valuable. It was a starter drug. When people saw that their behavior mattered, it led to a constellation of positive habits in their life that buffered them when depression came knocking again. So what we're looking at is that simple act of scanning for new things that they were grateful for, when created a routine around it, and then done with a team or with a family, transformed the brain that was currently predisposed towards the negative based upon genes or the environment. So come back to my unicorn sister, Amy. Turns out whatever you attend to first becomes your reality. So how do we transform the reality to make it the most adaptive one to improve the lives of the people around us? Which led to one last habit that I'll mention, the highest success rate, most powerful one, and then I'll pass it over to you, Jordan. I'm taking up 3 minutes of your time. Sorry about this. But I love this one. At Facebook and LinkedIn, and now we've done this worldwide, including with Jordan, we got people to do this when they came into work. One of the very first things we asked them to do was write a 2-minute positive email praising or thanking people within their life. That's it. It's a 2-minute positive email. This sounds so soft, given the challenges we've been experiencing over the past year, right? This is why we do this research, though. We're looking to see if small things like a vaccine, small things like exercise, small things like gratitude could have huge implications for a culture. And that's exactly what we found. We got people to each day write a 2-minute positive email, 2 minutes or less, praising or thanking someone in their life, and a different person each day for 21 days. You do it today, when we leave here, it'll be one of the best things you do all day. You do it for 3 days in a row, your brain gets addicted to it. You spend that all day long thinking about how amazing you were for writing that email in the morning. You're like, I'm the kind of person who does this stuff. But the real value, especially with done if in teams, what we found is if you do this, day 8, everyone runs out of people. They're like, well, that's all my family and friends. I wrote to my mom twice. That's everyone. That's all. I can't do this experiment anymore. And the important part is then you have to scan. And around day 8 on average, it turns out people have to scan and they start thinking about those people they haven't thought of in a while, or their brain wasn't aware of, right? Like that mentor who got you into this, that person who's been so great in the midst of the pandemic for you, that friend who you haven't seen in a while because we've been separated, that has such a powerful, positive influence upon your life. I wrote to a high school English teacher I hadn't thought of in 2 decades. And I said, you were the reason I fell in love with reading. You were the reason I ended up writing a book later in life. Thank you for changing my life. It took me 45 seconds to type. It took me longer to find that woman's email address online. When you think about your people, that's your brain maps your social connections. And we've got these strong nodes around our family and our friends that we constantly see. And some of them evaporated in the midst of the pandemic. But here's what happens. When you do this simple 2-minute habit on a daily basis, scanning for one person you're grateful for, your brain, when I thought about that woman, that teacher, I hadn't thought about her in 2 decades. She was not on my mental map. I thought about her and she faintly lights up. I write to her, activating her, and suddenly she lights up fully on my mental map of social connection. She's now in my ecosystem, being lit up by a 2-minute intervention. In this case, she wrote back, that doesn't happen to happen, but it does create a virtuous cycle when that occurs. But 21 days later, you have 21 people lighting up on your mental map. If you do that, your perception of social connection score rises to the top 15% of people worldwide. I want to conclude with this because what we're finding is the greatest predictor of your long-term levels of happiness right now is your social connection score, one that's been ravaged for many people by the pandemic. But what we're finding is even in the midst of the pandemic, a 2-minute positive intervention, getting people to scan for and write a 2-minute email praising or thanking someone in their life, completely transformed not only their lives, but the lives of the people that receive those pieces of praise. It's stunning how many times we've done this experiment where the response we get back from people is, you have no idea how much I needed to get this email today, right? But here's what we found. Social connection is the greatest predictor of your team's success rate. And finally, social connection is as predictive of how long we end up living as obesity, high blood pressure, or smoking, which means that, we fight so hard against the negative. We have to. But in the midst of that fight against the negative, we sometimes lose connection to how important the positive is. Or we don't think that the positive could possibly be as powerful as all this negative. And yet this research continually shows us 3 things. Our levels of happiness can change if we change our behavior or how we interact with other people. The second is that happiness and optimism becomes the greatest advantage in the modern economy. And if we flip around that formula, we can achieve greater levels of happiness that allow us to improve the lives of other people even better. And finally, happiness is contagious, lighting up that ecosystem around us in the midst of the darkness, which led to the work that we got to do with Jordan. Last year, we published an article in the Harvard Business Review based upon the incredible work Jordan is doing there. I'm going to pass it right over to him. But basically what we did is we took this idea of positive psychology, I wrapped it into a parable that could be very quickly read within 10 minutes by any member of a team about this frog who is orange or green that had these orange spots. When he started doing these positive things, he became more orange, which he hated because it made him different than all the other green frogs on this island. But then he starts realizing being orange is contagious and advantageous. So he starts trying to change the other ponds before the storm hits so they can find a way of creating their houses up in the trees. What we found is that story mirrored what happened when this research came into Genesis, not only transforming the levels of happiness of the people providing care, but raising their levels of patient safety to the top 1% in the entire nation and finding a way of making it better for us to achieve this happiness with one another. So Jordan, I'm so grateful to get to be joined with you here today. And I can't wait to get to hear this incredible ways in which you were able to take that research we just talked about in short form and then bring it to life.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sean. Can you see me?
I can see you.
Awesome. Sounds good. If we don't mind, Cindy, going to the next slide, trying to click through. Just a little bit about GMC Davenport, president of the hospital. We're a 502-bed hospital in the Quad City, Eastern Iowa, Western Illinois region. We have a strong collaboration with community healthcare. You all do outstanding work. We partner on OB, primary care, peds, and other patient populations. And thank you all for what you're doing, especially out on the front lines. So I love hearing Sean's talks, and it brings me back to where we got started. We got started a couple years ago, and it's really taken a look at how do we change the mindset. And I'm going to go fairly quick and maybe not as into such in-depth detail, but more as Sean spoke about, the more the better state of mind, the positivity, happier you are, the better you do. And it's really about changing that mindset. And that's really what we took on at the medical center. We were unfortunately in cost reduction mode a couple of years ago, and all of you understand, level of reimbursement, you're pressured more and more within healthcare. You have to do more with less. And how do you change that mindset? You have to be financial stewards of the community resources, the quality, the safety, continuing to grow, and have an engaged workforce. And so we really found a lot of value in the happiness advantage, and then moving into the Orange Frog Initiative and utilizing positivity to change that culture. In particular, the positive brain versus neutral, 31% more productive. We really work with the medical staff to say, okay, the long-term happiness, how do you change what you can really focus on? So internally, events occur. What is your perception of those events? 90% is how you perceive those events. Some things you can control and some things you can't, and 10% is related to external. It's all about cognitive reframing. I personally kick off every Orange Frog training with the staff and go to these sessions and where we do introductions and we talk about, job success. And that's predicted 25% based on your IQ. However, 75% is based on the positivity attributes. And that's why we're such a strong believer in the happiness advantage and Orange Frog Initiative. So as Sean did a great job explaining, there's individual, team, and organizational aspects of the Orange Frog Initiative. You have to embrace the positive outliers, see them in a positive direction. Later on in the presentation, we'll be going through and showing you actual pictures and how we utilize the Orange Frog Initiative to really enable the overall medical center to adopt positivity, and it really helped us on the outcome side. So we have the Orange Frog book and then the happiness advantage, and how do those interrelate, and really helps us with common language. We started this journey back in 2017 in the summer and fall. A part of our senior management team required that we do a book reading, and we picked Sean's book and we all adopted and said, this is great. However, we can't necessarily afford to go out on our own and buy these Orange Frog kits. So we partnered with our foundation and we fundraised about $300,000, and we've done a variety of different initiatives, and actually our physician community stepped up, provided donations as well. So with these kits, we had Orange Frog training sessions, and it's an 8-hour class where you bring frontline staff, and we've even had medical staff members come to these training to learn the common language and how do you embrace positivity. And here are some quick examples or pictures of everything. We have our volunteers in the top right corner, but every department where you turn within the medical center has some type of resemblance of Orange or Orange Frog. And those little subtle reminders throughout the day remind us to have a positive outlook on life. Every department has embraced this. We have our patient access where you check in at the initial aspect of the hospital. Our registers are riveting. The top right in behavioral health, our CAs and behavioral health techs are hopping. And then the bottom right is my favorite. This is Melinda up on our medical pulmonary unit. And these pictures are all pre-COVID because we've been doing this a couple of years. So if you're wondering why people are not wearing masks, but this is Melinda, and the medical pulmonary staff embraced this so much, they went out on their own and purchased orange gloves. And they say if you're not being very positive, they have the staff member wear orange gloves. So it's always interesting when out and about rounding, seeing who's wearing the orange gloves. But more importantly on that, when they go into a patient's room, you can imagine the patient says, why are you wearing orange gloves? And naturally it turns a smile on that individual's face and forces them to have a better day. This is Dawn from our OB unit who went through the Orange Frog training, talked about what I learned in the book, The Orange Frog, is that it takes just one simple act of kindness, a simple gesture to change the course of someone's day. By changing the mood, you ultimately, having a little computer issues, but you ultimately change your own mood. Being kind benefits you just as much as it benefits them. Everyone wins. Once you feel the benefits and witness positive change, the desire to continue is strong. Oh, there we go. I apologize about that. Here's more pictures, sterile processing, the lab, be positive like a proton. We even did a video. One of my favorite aspects of this on the left corner, that's Isaac, the gentleman, security guard doing a chest bump with Dr. Lewis, our pathologist. We actually did a video through the entire medical center celebrating the Orange Frog and the Positivity Initiative, because I can try to put myself in your shoes at the healthcare clinic, working so closely with providers. We value our medical staff members, but we also know you need to have medical staff and physician providers to support an initiative for it to be successful. So we really embrace this. I mean, how many times at the bottom right photo would you see Dr. Harbour, Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Gray, the hospitalist, and then 2 neonatologists dancing in front of a couple hundred people here in the medical center. And there's a video out on YouTube. If you Google Orange Frog Genesis Medical Center Davenport, you're welcome to see. Another key aspect, really focusing on the medical staff, is transforming the culture within the medical staff. That's Dr. Volson, who's one of our anesthesiologists. We have about 25 anesthesia providers who provide services here at the medical center. And he actually went through the entire Orange Frog initiative. And you tell me if it's coincidence or not, but interesting aspect of it is that the one anesthesia provider who's in the 99th percentile for patient experience is Dr. Volson. He literally carries around an orange frog and talks to all of his patients on how the orange frog changes his own personal happiness, positivity, optimism, outlook for his day, and that how it provides a better level of care, higher quality for taking care of his patients. On the right-hand side is, I took a little screenshot. So when I renegotiate contracts with medical staff members, I actually put in the duties and the responsibilities, active proponent and participant of the physician leader. And again, you need your medical staff, but they're some of the biggest supporters. How do you get a neurosurgeon to have common language with an environmental services employee? You know, previously we'd always walk down the hall and say, "Hi, how are you?" And the person says, "Good, how are you?" You're not listening to them, they're not listening to you. But now we have more interaction, common language, high five, great job. And really it takes a team effort. Here's a quick example of changing the culture and what can we do. Personally, write birthday cards, sharing appreciation. This gets back to Sean's point about being intentional, just a brief couple minutes a day, really intentional on this, on bringing us together and changing the culture to embrace positivity. I tell all the frontline staff when I kick off the individual sessions we're doing training. Unfortunately, we had to pause during COVID, but we're in the process of getting those back and going. Imagine if we all embrace positivity. I give a little story of, I don't like the heat or to be hot. And so when it's humid and wearing a full suit, before a couple of years ago, embracing positivity, I'd say, geez, it's so hot out. I can't stand being in a hot suit on the way to work. But now after going through the training and embracing these principles, I go outside, I say, wow, it's warm, but it's a beautiful day. And I tell all the staff of the 1,500 staff members coming here to the medical center every day, what if we all embrace that positivity? What could we do together to be successful more and more? As we talk about outcomes, I'm not going to read this entire email, but this is back in 2019. When we had staff members going through the training, we did a pre-survey and post-survey to say, are we truly changing the culture of the medical center? And then what's the business case related to that? And that's an afterthought, because I feel very strongly if we embrace people's personal optimism and happiness, thereby the organization will be more successful, thereby will provide higher quality care within our community. But you can see the results. Individuals reporting high stress at work dropped 30% post-training. Individuals responding very expressive about optimism jumped 23%. How optimistic were they before the training to 40% post? Percentage of happy at work went from 43% pre to 62% post. And then Genesis, as a medical center, are we going in the right direction? 37% before going through the training, yes, and 63% post, yes, going through the training, or yes, we're going in the positive direction for those individuals who took the survey post. And the most interesting aspect is we were doing these surveys, unfortunately, while we were in the pressure reducing north of $28 million in expenses that we had to do, unfortunately. So it's fascinating, and it really can change the culture and embrace positivity. And again, it's not necessarily about the recognition or the awards, but it's about the journey to achieve those. But here are some of the recognitions, most recently the medical center, and all the hats off to the frontline staff members and the medical staff members who made this happen on some really outstanding changes in culture. Are we perfect in every area? No, but we continue to get better, better, better. And I can't imagine where we would be with COVID if we did not have this training beforehand. Sustainment, what do we focus on? We focus on 2 positive activities. We focus on new staff members as well as medical staff members. And then we have our Quad City Coalition. We're coming together with other organizations within our community to embrace optimism. Just added this in here. What have we been doing to keep it alive during COVID? We went out and bought a couple thousand different masks that people could wear, talk about happy and healthy. the staff members did this for Bosses Day. They put a picture of me as a cartoon, as an orange frog out there, and we continue to focus more and more. So with that, appreciate the opportunity, and Cindy, we'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Jordan. We've had some great conversation in the chat and some questions that have come in. I do know we're running close on time, so I do promise that I'm going to get the questions to both Sean and Jordan, and we'll get some answers for you that we will share when we share the recording of the session today. So I appreciate the questions that did come in an effort to save a little bit of time right now. I think I want to jump straight to Sean. We had a question that came in about what are some of the next steps that folks on this session today could do when they want to implement some of the stuff or do what Jordan did at his health system. How do people go about doing this? What's their next step?
So I think that there's two next steps. One of them is that one of the things I've been impressed with watching the health systems in the midst of the pandemic is that all of these health providers know all about diseases and how you can, how contagious they are, and yet they don't avoid all of those people who are sick. They inoculate themselves, they put on a mask, they wash their hands, and they help people. And that by protecting their physical immune system, it allows them to help more people. So as we're trying to think about creating a positive ripple effect, I think we need to actually see that this works for ourselves first. So if you've been inspired by any of this research or been thinking about some of these ideas, what I would invite you to do is to adopt one of those habits we described, yourself, with your family, or with a team, or a couple people at work. Try it out and see if it has an impact upon you. When that happens, what occurs is not only you get to see how this research comes to life, but you also are improving your own emotional immune system, inoculating yourself against the negativity and stress that you might be experiencing, so you can start to create that positive ripple effect with other people. The second step is I think that what I've loved about the Orange Frog intervention is that it takes it from something you're doing alone to something you're doing with one another. And having that narrative there, I didn't expect as a researcher would make that much of a difference. It makes all the difference in the world. Because if I tell you that your productivity can rise by 15% or 31%, that doesn't make much change within your life. But when you have a narrative that, as you saw with Jordan, that you could see these visual representations of reminders about that positive culture change that link together all those different avenues of change you've already been implementing inside your organization, I think that that's where real change comes, because you get not only individual transformation, you get a cultural transformation where people don't feel like that they're alone doing it. So I would suggest and invite all of you to do is to take part. I know that NAC has set up some Orange Frog workshops. You could actually go through it yourself to see what they did at Genesis, what they've been doing at these hospital systems across the country, so you can actually experience it yourself. So you're not only doing this positive psychology research, but you're actually seeing it with other people and seeing it come to life. One of the things I found so fascinating when I first watched the Orange Frog do this was that, on one of those, it was a 2-day workshop. And at the end of day one, they had them all come wearing orange the next day. This is back when it was in person, right? And now they have virtual options and all of that. But the next day when they come into the office, they're wearing orange, and come into the hospital and they feel very different, right? Because they're wearing orange boas and orange hats. They look very different. And then they get into the training room with the people that they were in the Orange Frog with, and suddenly they're not different anymore. They're suddenly surrounded by all these other people who are wearing orange. And it became this very clear representation that I think so many of us want to create positive change. They're striving for it and feel tired and want help doing it. And suddenly, when you go through a program like the Orange Frog or a positive psychology intervention that's based upon a culture change, suddenly you realize you're not alone, and those hills of creating change inside an organization drop dramatically. Oh, those are the workshops there on the screen. Yes, perfect. That's exactly how you could get involved with it. So if you want to, I think the May one, I think they said this morning was sold out. So jump on whatever that next one is in June. I'm sure that there might be more coming in the pipeline, because I think what would make me so happy is that after this, it's not just like, oh, I heard a little bit about this positive research, but we're finding a way of actually sustaining resilient optimism in the midst of these challenges, especially given the incredible work that so many of you are doing in some of the most difficult communities.
All right, thank you, Sean, and thank you, Jordan, for your time today and sharing your research and the background at the health system. The May workshop is sold out. There are seats still left in the June workshop. You can go to the NAC webpage, or the link is there on the screen for you. And look forward to seeing you there. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me by email. And like I said, I'll reach out to Sean and Jordan and get some answers to the questions that came in today. Thank you for sharing your time with us today, and thank you for all that you do for our health centers and our communities across the nation. Have a good day.